3 weeks ago, my daughter Chloe texted me her Christmas list. Xbox games, makeup, the usual teenage stuff. Then at the bottom she wrote, "Also, we want a new dad." My son Griffin sent his list an hour later with the exact same line, word for word. I thought it was some TikTok joke they picked up. Kids say random stuff for attention, right? But something about the identical phrasing bothered me. When I asked them about it over dinner, they just looked at each other and shrugged. My wife, Catherine, jumped in real quick, saying they were probably just being dramatic because I'd been working late on the renovation project. See, here's what you need to understand about my situation. Catherine and I have been married 14 years. I'm a contractor, own my business, work hard to provide for this family. But apparently, working hard to pay for their lifestyle makes me the bad guy. For months, Catherine had been making these little comments about how I smell like motor oil, how my truck embarrasses her at school pickup, how other dads take their families on nice vacations. The complaints started ramping up after her friend Amanda got divorced and suddenly began posting all these photos with her new boyfriend and his boat. Amanda would come over for wine nights and they'd scroll through social media together, commenting on how lucky Amanda was to find someone financially stable and clean. Catherine would give me these looks afterward like I was some kind of disappointment. She started asking why I couldn't just get a normal job that didn't involve getting dirty, why I insisted on driving that old truck when other men drove nicer cars. I told her my business was doing well, that we had good money coming in, but she'd just roll her eyes and say it wasn't about the money. It was about appearance, about what people thought when they saw us together. She wanted a husband who looked the part, not someone who had sawdust in his hair and calloused hands. But I'd been paying attention, really paying attention, because 3 years ago I caught Catherine texting some guy from her yoga class. Nothing happened then, but it taught me to stay alert. Since August, I noticed her phone habits changed completely. She started taking calls outside, claiming it was her sister having marriage problems. She'd shower immediately after I got home from work, saying she couldn't stand the smell of sawdust on me anymore. She bought new clothes, started doing her hair differently. The kids' behavior shifted too. They stopped asking me to help with homework, stopped wanting to watch movies with me on weekends. Griffin used to love working on projects with me in the garage, but suddenly he was always too busy. Chloe stopped hugging me goodbye in the mornings. Said I smelled like work even after I'd showered. Griffin even asked if he could go to his friend's house for Christmas morning this year. When I said no, he got this weird look like he was disappointed but not surprised. I started noticing other things too. Catherine would get text messages and immediately put her phone face down. She'd leave the room to answer calls from unknown numbers. She started working late more often, claiming her job required extra hours, but when I called her office a few times, she wasn't there. The final piece that confirmed my suspicions was when I found a business card in her car's cup holder, some financial advisor named Ford. When I asked her about it, she said Amanda had recommended him for investment advice. But something about the way she answered felt rehearsed. Christmas morning arrived and something felt off immediately. Catherine was already dressed nicely at 7 a.m., which never happens. The kids were sitting on the couch fully dressed, too, not in pajamas like every other Christmas. They opened their presents methodically, no excitement, like they were going through motions. I kept asking if everything was okay, why everyone seemed so formal and distant. Catherine kept deflecting, saying they were just excited about the day, but Griffin and Chloe barely looked at me, barely responded when I tried to engage them about their gifts. Then Griffin handed me an envelope. "This one's for you, Dad." The way he said it was flat, emotionless. Inside was a restraining order, professionally printed, already filed, dated 3 days earlier. Catherine had been planning this for months, documenting everything to make me look like some kind of threat. The order stated I couldn't come within 500 feet of the house, the kids' school, or Catherine's workplace. Before I could even process what I was holding, the front door opened. This guy I'd never seen before walked in like he owned the place. Tall, clean-shaven, wearing expensive clothes. Catherine immediately went to his side, and Griffin and Chloe jumped up like they'd been waiting for him all morning. Catherine put her arm around this stranger and announced to the kids that they could finally meet their real father figure. The guy introduced himself as Ford and started talking about how excited he was to finally be part of their family now that all the legal stuff was handled. He pulled out keys to what was obviously an expensive car and asked the kids if they wanted to see their new ride. Griffin and Chloe practically ran to the window to look outside. I could see a black luxury SUV parked in my driveway, the kind that cost more than I make in 2 years. Griffin looked right at me and said, "Ford has a boat, not some rusty truck that breaks down every month and embarrasses them at school." Chloe added that Ford doesn't smell like motor oil and sawdust all the time and that his hands are clean and soft. They said it like they'd been practicing these lines for weeks, like Catherine had coached them on exactly what to say to hurt me most. The words came out too smoothly, too rehearsed. That's when Catherine dropped the real bomb. She told me they'd been planning this transition since August, that Ford had been helping her get everything in order for months. She said the kids needed stability and someone who could provide properly for them, not someone who came home dirty every day and drove an embarrassing vehicle that made them ashamed to be seen with me. She talked about how Ford understood what a real family needed, how he had the resources to give them experiences I never could. Ford started talking about taking the kids on vacation next week, how he'd already booked tickets to some resort in Florida. He mentioned that his house had a pool and game room, things he knew they'd always wanted. He said they could finally live like normal kids whose father wasn't covered in sawdust and motor oil. The kids were hanging on every word like he was some kind of hero, swooping in to rescue them from their embarrassing life with me. I stood there holding this restraining order while my family acted out this little performance they'd obviously rehearsed for months. Catherine kept talking about how Ford understood what a real family needed, how he could give them experiences I never could afford. She said she'd tried to make our marriage work but couldn't pretend anymore that I was enough for them. She talked about how the kids deserved better than a father who embarrassed them, who couldn't provide the lifestyle their friends had. Ford kept showing off photos on his phone of his house, his boat, his cars. He talked about private schools he could send the kids to, vacations they could take, opportunities I'd never be able to give them. He made it clear that money was no object for him, that he could provide everything a family needed without having to get his hands dirty or drive a rusty truck. But here's what Catherine doesn't know, what none of them know. I've been preparing for something like this for years, not because I'm paranoid, but because I learned a long time ago that when people show you who they really are, you better believe them and plan accordingly. 3 years ago, when I caught those text messages, I didn't just forgive and forget. I started preparing for the possibility that Catherine would eventually follow through on whatever she was thinking. So while they were celebrating their new family arrangement, and Ford was showing off photos of his house, I walked to my truck and grabbed 2 envelopes I'd been keeping in my toolbox for exactly this kind of situation. These weren't some last-minute revenge plan. I'd been preparing these for 2 years, updating them regularly, making sure everything was current and accurate. I handed one to Griffin and one to Chloe. The envelopes were thick, substantial, sealed with their names written in my handwriting. I told them to open these when they turned 18, that everything they needed to understand about today was inside those envelopes. I made sure they understood this was important, that they needed to keep these safe until they were old enough to make their own decisions. The kids took them without really paying attention, too focused on Ford's promises about jet skis and vacation plans. Catherine immediately demanded to know what was in the envelopes, but I just told her she'd find out eventually. Ford tried to step in and play the protective stepdad role, saying I needed to respect the boundaries they'd established and stop trying to manipulate the situation. I let him talk, let him think he'd won something. That was 6 days ago. My phone hasn't stopped ringing since yesterday morning. Catherine's lawyer called this morning, and the conversation didn't go how she expected. Apparently, I'm what she called a genius monster, but she wouldn't explain what that meant. She just kept demanding to know what I'd put in those envelopes and threatening me with contempt charges if I was trying to manipulate the kids or interfere with the custody arrangement. I told her the envelopes contained information the kids had a right to know when they were old enough to understand it. She started getting frantic, asking if I was planning to contest the restraining order or fight for custody. When I said no, she seemed confused. She kept pushing, wanting to know what my angle was, what I was planning to do next. But the really interesting calls started coming from Ford. Turns out Mr. Perfect isn't quite as confident as he was on Christmas morning. He called yesterday afternoon asking if we could meet to discuss the situation like mature adults. He said he wanted to make sure there were no hard feelings and that we could coexist peacefully for the kids' sake. When I told him I had no intention of interfering with their new family arrangement, He seemed relieved at first, but then he started pressing about the envelopes, asking what kind of father gives his children sealed letters and tells them to wait years to open them. He said it was manipulative and unfair to put that kind of burden on kids. The conversation got interesting when he started asking specific questions about my business, about my finances, about things Catherine might have told him. He seemed particularly concerned about whether I had any kind of legal recourse, or if there were aspects of the situation he didn't know about. For someone who was supposed to be celebrating his victory, he sounded awfully worried about something. Update 1. You guys asked for an update, so here it is. Things have gotten very interesting since my last post. Ford called again yesterday, this time much more insistent about meeting face-to-face. He kept saying we needed to clear the air and make sure there were no misunderstandings between us. When I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop downtown, I could hear the relief in his voice. He thought he was going to charm his way into getting information out of me. The meeting was exactly what I expected. Ford showed up in his expensive suit, trying to play the reasonable adult who just wants what's best for everyone. He started by telling me how much he cares about Griffin and Chloe, how he never intended to come between them and their father, how he hopes we can find a way to co-parent peacefully. He ordered some fancy coffee drink that probably cost more than I spent on lunch and kept checking his expensive watch like he had somewhere important to be. Then he got to what he really wanted to know. He asked me directly what was in those envelopes and why I thought it was appropriate to put that kind of pressure on children. He said Catherine was worried I was trying to turn the kids against their new family arrangement, that giving them sealed letters was a form of emotional manipulation. I told him the envelopes contained information the kids had a right to know about their family situation. Things they were old enough to understand when they turned 18. Ford kept pressing, wanting to know what kind of information, what could possibly be so important that it needed to be kept secret for years. That's when I decided to give him a little preview of what he was dealing with. I told him I'd been documenting Catherine's behavior for the past 3 years, not because I'm controlling or paranoid, but because I learned to pay attention when someone shows you who they really are. Ford's whole demeanor changed when I mentioned documentation. He started asking what exactly I'd been documenting, whether I had photos or recordings, what kind of evidence I thought I had collected. He was trying to sound casual, but I could see the panic starting to set in. I explained that when someone starts making plans to destroy your family, you pay attention to the details. You notice when phone habits change, when new clothes appear, when business cards for financial advisors show up in cars. You start keeping track of dates and times when things don't add up. Ford tried to turn it around on me, saying it sounded like I'd been spying on my own wife, that maybe Catherine had good reasons for wanting out of the marriage if I was that suspicious and controlling. He said healthy relationships were built on trust, not surveillance. That's when I asked him how long he'd been helping Catherine plan this whole thing. The look on his face was priceless. He started stuttering about how they'd only recently gotten serious, how their relationship developed naturally over time, how he never encouraged her to leave me. I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo I'd taken back in September. Catherine and him having lunch at a restaurant downtown, looking very comfortable with each other, very familiar. I told him I had dozens of similar photos from different dates, different locations, all time-stamped and saved. Ford's face went white. He wanted to know why I'd been following them, whether I was planning to use the photos in some kind of legal action. I told him I wasn't following anyone. I was just paying attention to my wife's schedule when she claimed to be working late or meeting with girlfriends. The conversation got really interesting when Ford started asking about my business, about whether I had any kind of financial leverage or legal connections. He seemed particularly worried about whether I had documentation of their relationship from before Catherine filed for the restraining order. I let him sweat for a while before explaining that everything I'd collected was perfectly legal. Taking photos in public places, keeping track of my own wife's activities, documenting inconsistencies in her stories. None of that was stalking or harassment. It was just being observant. But here's what really got to Ford. I told him I knew about the investment advice story Catherine had given me about his business card. I asked him how long he'd been managing her money, helping her move assets around, preparing for this transition. Ford immediately got defensive, saying he'd never done anything inappropriate with Catherine's finances, that any investment advice he'd given was completely professional. He said he was a licensed financial advisor, and everything he'd done was above board. That's when I knew I had him. See, Catherine doesn't have any significant assets to invest. She works part-time at a doctor's office, makes decent money, but nothing that would require professional investment advice. The only substantial money in our family comes from my business, money that Ford definitely shouldn't have been advising her about. Ford realized his mistake immediately. He started backtracking, saying he'd only given her general advice about financial planning for the future, nothing specific to our marital assets. But the damage was done. He'd just confirmed that he'd been helping Catherine plan her financial strategy for months before she filed anything. The meeting ended with Ford trying to salvage the situation. He said he hoped we could keep things civil for the kids' sake, that whatever issues Catherine and I had shouldn't affect Griffin and Chloe's happiness. He reminded me that the restraining order was still in effect and that I needed to respect the boundaries that had been established. I told him I had no intention of violating any legal orders, but that I also had no intention of pretending this whole situation was legitimate. The kids were going to learn the truth eventually, whether that was in 6 months or 6 years. After Ford left, I got a call from Catherine. She was furious that I'd met with Ford without telling her, that I'd shown him photos and made accusations about their relationship timeline. She said I was trying to sabotage their new life together, and that it wasn't fair to drag Ford into our marital problems. Catherine demanded to know what else I had, what other information I'd been collecting, whether I was planning to cause problems for them legally. She kept insisting that everything she'd done was justified, that she had every right to find happiness with someone who could provide properly for her and the kids. I asked her when exactly she'd decided I wasn't enough for them. Was it back in August when the planning started, or earlier when she began comparing me to Amanda's new boyfriend? Catherine got defensive, saying she'd tried to make our marriage work for years, but couldn't continue living with someone who embarrassed her. She said I never understood what it was like for her to have to explain to other parents why her husband drove a beat-up truck and came to school events covered in sawdust. She said the kids deserved better than having a father who looked like a laborer, who couldn't take them nice places or buy them the things their friends had. Catherine kept talking about how Ford understood what a real family looked like, how he could provide the kind of stability and lifestyle she'd always wanted. She said the kids were already happier, already adjusting to their new situation, already calling for their real dad. That's when I told her about the envelopes again. I explained that Griffin and Chloe were going to get a very complete picture of how this whole situation developed when they were old enough to understand it. Catherine started screaming that I was manipulating children, that I was trying to poison them against their mother. I stayed calm and told her the envelopes contained nothing but facts, dates, times, photos, copies of documents, a complete timeline of how their family was destroyed. When the kids turned 18, they'd be able to see exactly how long this had been planned and exactly who had been involved. Catherine's voice changed completely. She started asking what specific documents I had, whether I'd somehow gotten access to her personal information, whether anything I'd collected could be used against her legally. The panic was obvious now. She kept asking about dates and timelines, wanting to know exactly what I'd observed and when. I told her she'd find out what I had when the kids opened those envelopes. Until then, she could enjoy her new life with Ford and stop calling me about it. But the calls didn't stop. Catherine called back 3 more times yesterday, each time more frantic than the last. She wanted to know if there was any way to see the contents of the envelopes early, whether we could work out some kind of arrangement where I'd show her what I'd given the kids. Ford has been calling too. He wants to meet again, this time with Catherine present. He keeps saying they want to clear up any misunderstandings, that maybe we can find a way to move forward that works for everyone. The funny thing is, they both keep acting like I'm the one causing problems, like I'm the one who planned this whole thing, who destroyed our family, who's manipulating the children. They can't seem to understand that I'm just responding to what they did to me. Griffin texted me yesterday asking when he could see me again. He said Ford was nice, but he missed working on projects together. He asked if I still had his tools in the garage and whether we could finish the birdhouse we'd been building before Christmas. Chloe sent me a message saying she still had her envelope and was keeping it safe like I asked. She said Catherine kept asking her about it, but she hadn't told her anything. I think the kids are starting to realize that their perfect new family situation might not be exactly what they thought it would be. Ford's house might have a pool and game room, but it doesn't have the workshop where Griffin learned to use power tools or the corner where Chloe and I used to build elaborate blanket forts. Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't replace years of shared memories and genuine connection. Update 2. Holy cow, you guys were right about this getting worse before it gets better. The past week has been absolutely wild. Catherine and Ford finally got their meeting with me, and it went exactly like I expected. They showed up together at the same coffee shop. Catherine looking like she hadn't slept in days, and Ford trying to maintain his calm businessman act. They'd obviously spent hours planning what they were going to say because they had this whole coordinated approach worked out. Ford started by apologizing for any misunderstandings about his role in this situation. He said he never meant to interfere with my relationship with the kids, that he was just trying to support Catherine through a difficult transition. Catherine jumped in, talking about how they'd tried to handle everything as respectfully as possible, how the restraining order was just meant to create healthy boundaries during the divorce process. I let them talk for about 10 minutes before I asked them why they really wanted to meet. Catherine immediately started demanding to know what was in those envelopes and why I thought it was appropriate to keep secrets from children about their own family situation. She said Griffin and Chloe had been asking her questions she couldn't answer, and it wasn't fair to put them in that position. Ford tried a different approach. He said he understood I was angry about how things had developed, that divorce was always difficult, but that continuing to create mystery and tension wasn't helping anyone. He offered to pay for family counseling for all of us, said he had connections with excellent therapists who specialized in blended family situations. That's when I decided to give them another little preview of what they were dealing with. I told Catherine I knew about the apartment. The look on her face was priceless. She started stuttering about how she didn't know what I meant. What apartment? Why would I think there was an apartment? See, back in October, I'd followed Catherine when she said she was going to a late doctor's appointment. Instead of the medical building, she drove to an apartment complex across town. I watched her use a key to let herself into a ground floor unit where Ford was already waiting. She spent 3 hours there before driving home and telling me the appointment had run long. Ford's face went completely white when I mentioned this. He started talking about how Catherine had needed a safe space to think about her future, how he'd helped her rent a place where she could have some privacy during a difficult time. Catherine was shaking her head, telling him to stop talking, that he was making it worse. I pulled out my phone again and showed them photos of Catherine going in and out of that apartment on different days in October and November. I had timestamps showing she was there on afternoons when she'd told me she was working late or visiting her sister. I had photos of Ford's car parked in the same complex on the same days. Catherine started crying, saying I was stalking her, that it wasn't normal for a husband to follow his wife around taking pictures. She said my behavior proved she was right to get the restraining order, that I was obsessive and controlling and exactly the kind of person she needed protection from. Ford tried to take control of the conversation. He said regardless of what had happened in the past, we needed to focus on moving forward in a way that was healthy for everyone. He said the kids were what mattered most, and that continuing to dig up old grievances wasn't going to help them adjust to their new family situation. I asked Ford how long he'd been planning to become their new family situation. Had he started thinking about replacing me back in August when this all began? Or was it earlier when he first met Catherine? Ford said he'd never planned anything, that his relationship with Catherine had developed naturally, and that he'd only wanted to help her find happiness. That's when I told them about the other documentation, not just photos and dates, but recordings. Catherine's face went completely pale. She wanted to know what recordings, when I'd recorded anything, whether I'd been taping their phone calls or conversations. I explained that I'd never recorded anything illegally. But when your wife starts having long phone conversations outside and then comes in telling you she was talking to her sister, you start paying attention to what she's actually saying. When someone talks loud enough for neighbors to hear, it's not really a private conversation anymore. Catherine started demanding to know exactly what I'd heard, what conversations I was talking about, whether I had any proof of what I was claiming. Ford was trying to calm her down, telling her not to say anything else, that they should probably talk to a lawyer, but Catherine was too panicked to stop. She kept asking me whether I knew about specific things, whether I'd been listening to particular conversations, whether I understood the context of anything I might have overheard. With each question, she was confirming more of what I already knew. I told them both that everything I had would be in those envelopes when Griffin and Chloe turned 18. Until then, they could wonder exactly what their children were going to learn about how their family was destroyed. Ford tried one last time to negotiate. He offered to buy me out of the house, said he could arrange for generous child support payments, suggested we could work out a custody arrangement that gave me significant time with the kids if I'd agree to destroy whatever information I'd collected. I told him the kids already had the information and they'd decide for themselves what to do with it when they were old enough. Ford said that was unreasonable, that asking children to keep secrets about their parents was a form of emotional abuse, that no court would support what I was doing. The meeting ended with Catherine sobbing and Ford trying to figure out damage control. They both kept insisting I was being cruel and manipulative, that I was punishing innocent children for adult problems, that I needed to think about what was best for Griffin and Chloe. But here's the thing that's really got them worried. The kids are starting to ask their own questions. Griffin called me a few days ago wanting to know why Catherine seemed so upset all the time, why she kept asking them about the envelope, why Ford seemed nervous whenever my name came up. Chloe texted me asking if she was supposed to show the envelope to Catherine or keep it private like I'd said. She said Catherine had been trying to convince her to open it early, saying that keeping secrets from your mother wasn't healthy. That if the envelope really contained important information, then she should know about it now. I told both kids that the envelopes were meant for them to open when they turned 18, that they contained information about their family that they had a right to know but weren't quite ready to understand yet. I said if Catherine was pressuring them about it, they could tell her I'd said the envelopes were their choice to make when they were older. Griffin asked me directly whether Catherine and Ford had been lying to them about how long they'd known each other. He said some things didn't add up about their story, that Catherine had told them she'd only met Ford recently, but Griffin remembered seeing him at a school event back in the fall. I told Griffin that when he opened his envelope in a few years, he'd have a complete timeline of everything that happened and could decide for himself what he thought about it. Griffin said he was starting to think maybe the timing of everything wasn't as spontaneous as Catherine and Ford had made it seem. Chloe has been asking different questions. She wanted to know why I hadn't seemed surprised on Christmas morning when Ford showed up. Why I'd had those envelopes ready like I'd been expecting something to happen. She said Catherine told her I was trying to manipulate them, but that if I Marche had been planning something, wouldn't I have tried to stop the restraining order, instead of just accepting it? Catherine called me yesterday absolutely furious about my conversations with the kids. She said I was filling their heads with doubts and suspicions, that I was trying to turn them against their new family before they'd even had a chance to adjust. She demanded that I tell Griffin and Chloe to stop asking questions and just focus on being happy with their new situation. I told Catherine that if the kids were asking questions, maybe it was because they were smart enough to notice when things didn't make sense. Catherine started screaming that I was poisoning their minds, that I was teaching them not to trust their own mother, that I was destroying their chance at happiness. Ford got on the phone and tried to be more diplomatic. He said he understood this was difficult for everyone, but that the kids needed stability and consistency right now, not more confusion. He offered again to arrange for professional help. Said a family therapist could help all of us navigate this transition in a healthier way. I asked Ford whether he thought a family therapist would be interested in the timeline of how this transition had actually developed. Ford said the past didn't matter as much as moving forward constructively, that everyone had made mistakes and needed to focus on building something positive for the kids, but the kids aren't buying it anymore. Griffin texted me this morning saying he'd been thinking about everything and wanted to know if there was a way for him to see me without violating the restraining order. He said he missed our weekend projects and wanted to understand why everything had changed so suddenly. Chloe sent me a message asking whether the envelope contained information about why Catherine and Ford seemed so worried all the time. She said their perfect new family didn't feel as perfect as everyone kept insisting it was supposed to be. I think Catherine and Ford are starting to realize that their plan might not be working out exactly the way they thought it would. Final update. You guys are not going to believe what happened. Griffin opened his envelope yesterday, and everything has completely exploded. I got a text from Griffin Thursday afternoon asking if he could open his envelope early. He said he couldn't stop thinking about all the inconsistencies in Catherine and Ford's story, and he needed to know the truth. He'd been doing his own detective work, asking Catherine specific questions about when she met Ford, and nothing was adding up. I told him the envelope was his, and he could open it whenever he felt ready. 20 minutes later, my phone rang, and it was Griffin crying. Not just upset, but absolutely devastated. He'd read everything, and he was furious. See, here's what was actually in those envelopes. A complete timeline of Catherine and Ford's relationship, starting from their first meeting in July, not August, like they'd been claiming. Photos of them together at restaurants, the apartment complex, even at Griffin's baseball game in September, where Ford had been sitting in the stands pretending to be just another parent. But the photos weren't even the worst part. I'd included printed screenshots of text message conversations between Catherine and Ford that I'd managed to photograph when Catherine left her phone unlocked. Messages where they discussed how to manipulate the kids into wanting Ford around, how to make me look bad, how to time everything for maximum impact. There were messages where Catherine complained about having to pretend to love me until the legal paperwork was ready. Messages where Ford joked about my truck and my appearance, calling me the kind of man who embarrassed successful people. Messages where they planned exactly what the kids should say on Christmas morning. Griffin read conversations where his mother talked about coaching him and Chloe to reject me, where she discussed which of my insecurities to target, where she planned to use my love for my children as a weapon. He saw messages where Ford suggested specific phrases for the kids to use, where Catherine practiced the exact words that would make me feel like a failure. The envelope also contained copies of documents showing that Catherine had been planning the restraining order since October, working with Ford to create situations that could be twisted into evidence. There were drafts of the restraining order application with notes in Ford's handwriting suggesting which incidents to emphasize. But what really destroyed Griffin was seeing the messages where Catherine and Ford discussed how temporary this would all be. How once the divorce was finalized, they could move the kids to Ford's house permanently and gradually reduce my contact with them until I was essentially out of their lives. Griffin called Catherine immediately after reading everything. He confronted her about the timeline, about the apartment, about the messages planning the manipulation. Catherine tried to explain that the situation was complicated, that she'd been trying to protect him and Chloe from a difficult situation. Griffin wasn't buying any of it. He asked her directly whether she'd ever loved me or if the whole marriage had been fake. Catherine started crying and trying to explain that people change, that she'd grown out of love with me over time. But Griffin kept pressing. He wanted to know why she'd lied about when she met Ford, why she'd coached him to say cruel things to me on Christmas morning, why she'd planned to gradually remove me from their lives. Catherine got defensive and said Griffin was too young to understand adult relationships. That's when Griffin lost it completely. He told Catherine he understood perfectly well that she'd betrayed our family for money and status, that she'd manipulated her own children into hurting their father, that she'd spent months planning to destroy the only parent who'd actually loved them. Catherine started panicking and called Ford for backup. Ford tried to calm Griffin down, explaining that divorce was complicated and that they had only been trying to make the change as easy as possible for everyone. Griffin asked Ford directly why he'd been sitting at his baseball games pretending to be a stranger when he was already planning to replace his father. Ford said he'd been supporting Catherine during a difficult time and wanted to understand what her children were like. Griffin told Ford that sounded like stalking behavior and asked how long he'd been studying their family before deciding to destroy it. Ford got frustrated and said Griffin was being dramatic, that blended families required planning and preparation. But Griffin wasn't finished. He'd read every single message, every document, every piece of evidence I'd collected. He knew about the apartment rental timeline, the financial planning sessions, the discussions of how to minimize my custody rights. He confronted them with specific dates until both Catherine and Ford stopped trying to explain and started demanding to know what else was in the envelope. Griffin told them they'd find out when Chloe opened hers and that he was going to make sure she knew exactly what kind of people they really were. Catherine started begging Griffin not to poison his sister against them, saying that Chloe was younger and wouldn't understand the complexity. Griffin said Chloe deserved to know the truth about how their family was destroyed just like he did. He said Catherine had forfeited the right to control what her children knew when she decided to manipulate them into betraying their father. Catherine called me absolutely hysterical. She was sobbing and screaming that I'd turned her son against her, that I'd violated her privacy, that I'd destroyed any chance of Griffin accepting Ford as a parental figure. She demanded that I tell Griffin the evidence was fake or taken out of context. I told Catherine that Griffin was smart enough to read timestamps and recognize her own words. If she had a problem with what he'd learned, maybe she should have thought about that before she wrote those messages. Ford got on the phone and tried a different approach. He said he understood I was angry, but that I was hurting innocent children by forcing them to choose sides. He said Griffin was devastated and confused and that continuing to escalate the situation wasn't helping anyone heal. I asked Ford whether he thought Griffin seemed confused or whether he seemed like someone who'd finally learned the truth about what had been done to his family. Ford said I was teaching Griffin to be vindictive and unforgiving, that I was modeling toxic behavior, but Griffin had already made his own decisions. He texted me that evening saying he wanted to come live with me as soon as the custody arrangement would allow it. He said he couldn't stand being in the same house with people who'd spent months planning to betray him and his sister. He said Ford's house felt like living with strangers who'd studied them like lab rats. Griffin also said he was done pretending to be happy about the new family situation. He told Catherine and Ford he wouldn't be calling Ford his father or accepting him as a parental figure. He said he understood exactly what they'd done, and he wouldn't be participating in their fantasy. Chloe texted me asking whether she should open her envelope too. She said Griffin had been crying and angry since yesterday, and that Catherine kept trying to convince her that I'd filled the envelope with lies. She wanted to know what Griffin had learned that made him so upset. I told Chloe the envelope was hers to open when she felt ready, but that it contained the same information Griffin had received. I said she should be prepared that it might be difficult to read, but that she had a right to know the truth about what had happened to her family. As of this morning, Catherine and Ford are in full damage control mode. They've been calling me non-stop trying to negotiate some kind of arrangement where I'd convince Griffin that the evidence was taken out of context. Ford offered to double any child support payments if I'd agree to tell the kids I'd misunderstood what I documented, but it's too late for damage control. Griffin has already started asking other people about the timeline. He called Catherine's sister asking when she'd first heard about Ford and found out Catherine had been talking about him since August, not December, like she'd told the kids. The restraining order hearing is next week, and Griffin has asked if he can speak to the judge about the evidence in his envelope. Catherine's lawyer called mine, saying they want to discuss modifying the custody arrangement and potentially withdrawing some of the claims in the restraining order petition. Ford hasn't been around the house much since Griffin's confrontation. Catherine told me he's been staying at his own place more often, saying he needs time to figure out how to handle the situation. Sounds like their perfect new family isn't quite as solid as they thought it would be when the kids learn the truth. Griffin texted me this morning saying he's been thinking about everything, and he finally understands why I had those envelopes ready on Christmas morning. He said I must have known exactly what they were planning and prepared accordingly. He asked me how long I'd been documenting their betrayal. I told Griffin I'd suspected something was wrong for months and had started paying attention to the details. I said I'd hoped I was wrong, but wanted to make sure he and Chloe would eventually learn the truth about what had really happened, even if it took years. Griffin said he was proud that I'd been smart enough to document everything, and that he was sorry he'd believed their lies about me being a disappointment. He said he understood now that the only person who'd actually been looking out for his and Chloe's best interests was me. Catherine and Ford spent months planning their perfect betrayal, coaching my children to reject me, manipulating every detail for maximum emotional damage. But they forgot one important thing. The truth has a way of coming out eventually, and kids are a lot smarter than adults give them credit for. The best part is that I never had to break any laws or do anything unethical. I just paid attention, documented what I observed, and made sure my children would eventually have access to the facts. Catherine and Ford destroyed themselves with their own words and actions. Sometimes the best revenge is just making sure people face the natural consequences of their choices. Welcome to Hidden Lies, where we expose the raw truth behind everyday deceptions. If this story hit hard, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss an update. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in this situation? We'll see you in the next one.